Hey guys, tonight we're talking about death, Viking death. And no, it's not a glorious slow-mo charge with a sword in your hand and a Valkyrie waiting to sweep you off to a golden hall. It's slipping on a wet rock while checking your fishing nets and bleeding out into a fjord. It's dying in childbirth with no healer, but a midwife and a handful of herbs. It's starvation, infection, drowning, or, if you were really unlucky, being turned into a human sacrifice and set on fire in your own longship. Tonight, we're not just lifting the curtain on the Viking afterlife. We're tearing it off the wall. We're diving into a world where dying well was an obsession, where the difference between eternal feasting and eternal darkness came down to how you died, and sometimes whether your friends had enough wood to build you a proper pyre. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that low, eerie hum in the background. Because tonight we're heading to the edge of the world to meet the dead, the damned, and the undead. Congratulations, you've just died. Not in a blaze of glory, not with a sword in your hand and a war cry on your lips. No. You slipped on a wet rock while checking your fishing nets, hit your head, and bled out quietly into the fjord. Your last thought wasn't of Odin or the shimmering gates of Valhalla. It was about the terrible irony of being taken down by a patch of moss. Welcome to death in the Viking Age, a world where the end was not a distant sanitized event, but a constant, muddy, and often deeply disappointing neighbour. The stories we tell ourselves about this era are grand epics of horned helmets, dragon-proud longships, and heroic warriors feasting for eternity in a golden hall. But the truth, as always, is far grittier. For the average person living in the windswept, unforgiving landscape of Scandinavia, death was not a glorious finale. It was a mundane terror, a casual cruelty that could arrive in the form of an infected splinter, a botched childbirth, a bad harvest, or a rival's axe swung in a drunken argument over a stolen goat. Your life was a tightrope walk over a pit of rusty spears, and most people didn't make it to the other side. This wasn't a world of pensions and healthcare. It was a world where a toothache could kill you, where a harsh winter could wipe out half your village, and where the gods themselves were capricious, demanding, and preparing for their own bloody apocalypse. Your mortality wasn't a philosophical concept. It was a physical reality you faced every single day. So before we journey into the feasting halls of the afterlife, we must first walk through the blood, the filth, and the fear of the end. We must understand how you died, why you died, and what your friends and enemies did with your body afterward. Because in the Viking Age, your death was just as important as your life. In fact, it was the final, defining act of your story, and it determined where you'd spend the rest of eternity. Feasting with the gods, or shivering in a cold, dark hall at the bottom of the world. Forget everything you thought you knew, because dying well was an art form, and most people, including you, probably failed the test. In a world where life was a constant, grinding struggle against the elements, your neighbours, and your own bad luck, the concept of a good death was not just a preference. It was a spiritual obsession. And in the Viking Age, the best death The only truly honourable death for a man was to die in battle. It was the ultimate career move, a promotion straight to the halls of the gods, a final bloody exclamation point on a life lived with courage. To die with a weapon in your hand, with the screams of your enemies in your ears and your own blood staining the earth, was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. It was the one surefire way to catch the eye of the Valkyries. Those mythical warrior maidens who swoop down onto battlefields to select the worthiest slain for Odin's great hall, Valhalla. You didn't just hope for this kind of death, you actively sought it. An aging warrior might grow restless, fearing the slow, undignified decay of old age. He might deliberately seek out one last raid, one final glorious skirmish where he could go down swinging. To die in your bed was to die in shame. To die on the battlefield was to become a legend. The sagas are filled with heroes who meet their end this way, surrounded by the bodies of their foes. Their final breaths a curse upon their enemies and a prayer to the All-Father. But let's strip away the poetry and look at the grim reality. Dying in battle was not a clean, cinematic event. It was brutal, agonizing, and messy. You weren't struck down by a single, noble blow. You were hacked at with axes, stabbed with spears, and trampled by the shield wall. Your final moments were likely spent in excruciating pain, choking on your own blood, your guts spilling into the mud. An axe to the leg didn't just break a bone, it shattered it, leaving you to bleed out while your comrades fought on. A spear to the gut was a slow, agonizing death from infection days later. The sagas might speak of glory, but the bones tell a different story. Archaeologists have unearthed skeletons from this period bearing horrific wounds. Skulls cleaved in two, vertebrae pierced by arrowheads, limbs hacked off with savage force. This was not a quick or painless exit. Yet the belief in its spiritual reward was so powerful that it overrode the physical terror. It transformed a brutal, bloody end into a sacred transaction. Your life, given in violence, was exchanged for an eternity of feasting, fighting, and preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. Dying in battle was the Viking dream, a testament to a culture that valued courage above all else. It was the perfect death. But for every warrior who achieved it, thousands more met their end in far less glorious ways. And for them, a very different eternity awaited. If dying in battle was the grand prize, the VIP ticket to the afterlife, then dying of old age or sickness was the equivalent of being left in the cosmic parking lot. This was the straw death, a term loaded with contempt, a quiet, undignified exit that Vikings feared more than a berserker's axe. To die in a bed, a straw bed, surrounded by family, was not a peaceful passing. It was a spiritual failure. It meant you had outlived your usefulness, that you had not been brave enough or lucky enough to fall in the glorious chaos of combat. You had not earned your place in Valhalla. Instead, your soul was destined for a different, far less appealing destination. Hell. Hell, ruled by the goddess of the same name, was the Norse underworld. And while it wasn't the fire and brimstone pit of Christian tradition, it was no paradise. It was a cold, damp, dreary realm, a shadowy mirror of the living world where the spirits of the unworthy dead wandered in a state of perpetual gloom. There was no feasting, no fighting, no glory. There was just existence, a grey, monotonous eternity spent in the company of other people who'd failed to die a hero's death. The dishonor was immense. A man who died a straw death was not celebrated in song. His name was not carved onto runestones with tales of his valor. He was simply gone. This fear was so profound that it influenced how people lived. Some sagas tell of the elderly or the terminally ill taking matters into their own hands. Rather than wait for sickness to claim them, they might ask a family member to kill them with a spear, or they would wound themselves to simulate a battle death, hoping to trick the Valkyries. This practice, known as carving the blood eagle on oneself, in some interpretations, was a desperate attempt to cheat fate and secure a place among the chosen. It was a final, defiant act against the creeping shame of a natural death. For women, the straw death was the expected norm, as they were generally excluded from Valhalla's warrior-centric entry policy. But for a man, a warrior, it was a source of deep anxiety. It meant that all his life's deeds, all his raids and battles, were ultimately negated by the simple, humiliating act of succumbing to a cough or a fever. The straw death was a reminder that in the Viking worldview, how you died was the final judgment on how you lived. It was a cold, hard line drawn between the celebrated hero and the forgotten soul. While one feasted in Odin's hall, the other was left to shiver in the dark, a ghost in a kingdom of shadows, forever regretting that they hadn't found a blade to fall on when they had the chance. While the sagas glorify the warrior's end, the stark reality for most Vikings was that death was far more likely to come not from a sword, but from the land and the sea. The Scandinavian world was a beautiful but brutal place, a landscape of jagged fjords, dense forests, and unpredictable waters that gave life with one hand and took it with the other. For the vast majority of the population, who were farmers, not full-time warriors, daily life was a series of calculated risks, and a single moment of misfortune could be fatal. Farming in the north was a relentless struggle. The growing season was short, the soil rocky, and the weather unforgiving. A farmer could be killed by a falling tree while clearing land for crops. An ox-drawn plough could kick back with lethal force, or a simple slip of a scythe could result in a deep, septic wound. With no access to modern medicine, a minor injury could fester and lead to a slow, agonizing death from infection. A broken leg was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence, leaving a person unable to work and becoming a burden on their family. Malnutrition was a constant threat. A bad harvest, caused by a late frost or a summer drought, could mean starvation for an entire community. The bones of Vikings from this period often show signs of hardship, of lives spent in grueling physical labor, with inadequate nutrition. This was a world where a failed crop was not an economic setback. It was a life and death crisis. Then there was the sea. The Vikings were master shipbuilders and seafarers, but the North Sea was a merciless beast. Fishing was a vital source of food, but it was also one of the most dangerous professions. A sudden storm could capsize a small fishing boat in minutes, casting its crew into the freezing, churning water. There were no life jackets, no rescue crews. Drowning was a common, lonely death. Even on larger voyages, the risks were immense. Longships could be dashed against hidden rocks, lost in thick fog, or simply overwhelmed by the sheer power of the ocean. To be a sailor was to live with the constant knowledge that the sea, your source of wealth and adventure, could also be your grave. These everyday deaths lacked the glory of battle. There were no sagas written about the man who drowned checking his nets, or the farmer who died from a fever. These were the quiet, uncelebrated ends that were the norm for most. They were not paths to Valhalla. These souls were destined for hell, or in the case of the drowned, perhaps to the cold, watery hall of the sea goddess, Ran. It was a grim reminder that in the Viking Age, the greatest battles were not always fought against other men, but against the harsh, indifferent forces of nature itself. In the brutal landscape of the Viking Age, life was a battle for everyone, but for women, the battlefield was often inside their own homes, and the enemy was biology itself. While men sought glory on the seas and in the shield wall, women faced their own mortal perils with a different kind of courage. The most dangerous event in a Viking woman's life was childbirth. In a world without modern sanitation, obstetrics, or antibiotics, bringing a new life into the world was a high-stakes gamble that could, and often did, end in death for the mother, the child, or both. Midwives, usually experienced older women from the community, assisted with births, relying on folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and ritual chants. They knew how to turn a baby in the womb and could handle some complications, but a breech birth, a hemorrhage, or a postpartum infection was almost always a death sentence. There was no C-section, no epidural, no way to stop a catastrophic bleed. A woman could survive the labour only to die days later from a raging fever, leaving behind a newborn and a grieving family. The archaeological record paints a sombre picture. The graves of women from the Viking Age often show them buried with their infants, a silent testament to the devastating toll of childbirth. Because this danger was so common, dying in childbirth was viewed with a unique kind of respect. While it wasn't the warrior's path to Valhalla, it was considered an honourable death in its own right. A woman who died bringing forth a new warrior or a new mother for the clan was seen as having made a worthy sacrifice. Some scholars speculate that there may have been a special place in the afterlife reserved for these women, a recognition of their unique, life-giving struggle. Beyond childbirth, the domestic sphere was filled with its own hazards. Open hearth fires, essential for cooking and warmth, posed a constant risk of burns or smoke inhalation. Food preparation, without knowledge of germs, could lead to deadly food poisoning. Even the daily grind of domestic labour, grinding grain, hauling water, and managing the farmstead, was physically demanding and could lead to debilitating injuries. A fall in the home could be just as deadly as a fall on the battlefield. Women were the anchors of Viking society. They ran the farms while the men were away raiding, managed the household finances, and preserved the family's lineage and traditions. They were strong, capable, and essential. But their lives were framed by a constant, quiet proximity to death. They did not wield swords in the shield wall, but they fought their own battles every day, against infection, against exhaustion, against the brutal lottery of childbirth. Theirs was a different kind of heroism, one written not in sagas of war, but in the survival of their families and the endurance of their communities. In a society where personal honour was paramount and grievances were often settled with an axe, Viking law was a complex and surprisingly sophisticated system designed to keep the chaos at a manageable level. But when that system failed, or when a crime was deemed too severe, the consequences were brutal and often fatal. Justice was not administered by a central government, but by local assemblies called things, where free men gathered to pass laws, settle disputes, and pass judgment. If you were accused of a crime, you would be judged by your peers. But justice was not blind. It was heavily influenced by social status, wealth, and the number of powerful friends you could bring to the assembly. For lesser crimes, the typical punishment was a fine, paid in silver to the wronged party. This system of weregild, or man money, was a way to prevent endless cycles of revenge. But for more serious offences, like murder, treason, or breaking a sacred oath, the punishments were far more severe. One of the most feared fates was to be declared an outlaw. An outlaw was a wolf in a sacred place, a person stripped of all legal protection. They were legally dead. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty, and in fact, it was often encouraged. Their property was confiscated, their family shunned. They were forced to flee into the wilderness, to live a life of hiding and desperation, hunted by bounty hunters and their own former neighbours. It was a social and spiritual death that often preceded a very real and violent one. Then, there were formal executions. These were public events, designed not just to punish the individual, but to serve as a stark warning to the community. Methods varied by region and crime. Hanging was common, as was beheading. Drowning, especially for those accused of witchcraft or other taboo acts, was also practiced. But the most infamous and most debated form of Viking execution is the blood eagle. Described in lurid detail in some later sagas, this ritual was a grotesque spectacle of torture. The victim's back was allegedly cut open, their ribs severed from their spine, and their lungs pulled out to form a pair of bloody wings. It was a sacrifice to Odin, a death of unimaginable agony. Historians are divided on whether the blood eagle was a real practice or a literary invention, a piece of Christian propaganda designed to portray the Vikings as monstrous heathens. There is no archaeological evidence to support it, but the chilling descriptions in the sagas have cemented its place in popular imagination. Whether real or not, it speaks to a culture that understood the theatrical power of violence. In the Viking world, justice could be swift and brutal. A verdict at the thing could be your salvation or your doom. And if you found yourself on the wrong side of the law, your death was unlikely to be quick, quiet, or merciful. So, you've met your end. The chaos of battle, the slow creep of disease, or the sharp edge of the law has claimed you. What happens now? Your journey into the afterlife has begun. But first, your mortal remains must be dealt with by the living. For the average Viking, the funeral was a practical yet deeply symbolic affair, a final send-off that reflected their status in life and prepared them for the world to come. The most common form of burial was inhumation, or burying the body in the earth. The first step was to prepare the corpse. The body would be washed, dressed in its finest clothes, and often laid out on a bed of straw or a wooden plank for a period of mourning. This was a time for the family and community to pay their respects, to share stories, and to begin the process of grieving. The funeral itself was a communal event. A grave would be dug, usually in a family plot or a community cemetery located near the farmstead. The shape and orientation of the grave could vary. Some were simple pits, while others were lined with stones or wood. The body was often placed in a crouched or fetal position, perhaps symbolizing rebirth, or laid out straight, facing a particular direction, like north, which held spiritual significance. But you were never sent into the earth alone. The Vikings believed the dead needed provisions for their journey to the afterlife and for their existence there. These grave goods were essential. A warrior would be buried with his weapons, his sword, his axe, his shield, and his spear. These were not just practical tools for the next life. They were symbols of his identity. A woman might be buried with her jewelry, her weaving tools, her keys, and other domestic items that signified her role as the mistress of the household. Everyone, regardless of status, was typically buried with some basic necessities: a clay pot for food or drink, a knife, a comb. Even the poorest graves usually contain a few simple items, a testament to the belief that everyone needed something to carry with them into the unseen world. Sometimes, animals were sacrificed and buried with the dead: a horse for a chieftain to ride, a dog for a loyal companion, or even livestock to provide food in the afterlife. The funeral was a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It was a final act of care, a way of ensuring that the deceased was well equipped and honoured. Once the body and grave goods were in place, the grave was filled, and often marked with a simple mound of earth or a circle of stones. For most, this was the end. A quiet return to the earth, a body at rest, and a soul on its way. While the common farmer or fisherman received a simple earthen grave, the death of a chieftain, a king, or a wealthy jarl was an entirely different spectacle. This was not a quiet private affair. It was a monumental public display of power, wealth, and influence, designed to echo through eternity. The ultimate status symbol for the Viking elite was the burial mound, or barrow. These were not simple graves. They were massive man-made hills, colossal earthworks that dominated the landscape and served as permanent landmarks. Building a burial mound was an immense undertaking, requiring the coordinated labour of hundreds of people over weeks or even months. It was a chieftain's final command to his people, a testament to his ability to mobilise resources even in death. The mound was a symbol of his power and a claim to the land itself. It declared to all who saw it, for generations to come, "A great leader rests here. This land was, and is, his." Inside the mound, a burial chamber was constructed, often built of timber and stone, resembling a subterranean house. This chamber was where the deceased was laid to rest, not just buried, but enthroned. The body would be placed on a bed, in a chair, or sometimes even in a wagon, surrounded by a breathtaking array of grave goods that reflected their immense status. This wasn't just about preparing for the afterlife. It was about recreating a life of luxury in the next world. But the burial mound was more than just a tomb. It was a sacred space, a focal point for community rituals and ancestor worship. People would gather at the mounds during festivals to make offerings, to seek wisdom from the dead, or to honour their lineage. The mound connected the living to their past, reinforcing social bonds and the legitimacy of the ruling family. The dead chieftain was not gone. He was simply sleeping, a powerful ancestor watching over his people from his earthen hall. These mounds were so significant that they often became the centre of local folklore and superstition. They were seen as gateways to the other world, places of immense power and danger. They were believed to be guarded by spirits, or even by the animated corpse of the chieftain himself, the dreaded Draugr. To disturb a burial mound was not just grave robbing, it was a spiritual transgression of the highest order, an act that could bring a curse upon the entire community. In the end, the burial mound was the ultimate expression of Viking ambition. It was a way of conquering not just land, but time itself, ensuring that a leader's name and power would never be forgotten, etched forever into the very landscape they once ruled. If you were a person of importance in the Viking world, you didn't just get buried, you were curated. The grave goods placed in the burial mounds of the elite were not random trinkets. They were a meticulously assembled collection of power, wealth, and identity. A complete starter pack for a lavish afterlife. This was not about sentimentality. It was about ensuring the deceased maintained their high status in the next world. Imagine the burial chamber of a great chieftain. He would be surrounded by his entire arsenal, his finest sword, perhaps a pattern-welded blade imported from the Frankish kingdoms, its hilt inlaid with silver and garnet, his shield, his spears, and his axe, all symbols of his martial prowess. His helmet, a rare and precious item, would be placed by his side. He would need these not just for fighting in Valhalla, but as a declaration of who he was, a warrior and a leader. But a chieftain was more than a fighter. He was a man of wealth and taste. The chamber would be filled with luxurious items, exquisite jewelry, gold and silver arm rings, intricate brooches, and necklaces of amber, carnelian, and glass beads. Many of them acquired through trade or raids from distant lands like Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. Ornate drinking horns and imported glassware for the eternal feasts. Board games like Hanefa Tafel to pass the time. His finest clothing, made of silk and richly dyed wool, would be laid out, and he would need transport in the afterlife. His favorite horse, sometimes more than one, would be sacrificed and placed in the tomb, complete with its saddle and bridle. His dogs, loyal companions in life, would join him in death. Even his tools would be included. Blacksmithing equipment, woodworking tools, and farming implements, showing that a leader's power was rooted in the prosperity of his people. Perhaps most chillingly, the elite were sometimes not sent into the afterlife alone. Evidence from several high-status graves suggests that human sacrifices were part of the funeral rite. Enslaved people, servants, or female companions were sometimes killed and buried with their master, their lives considered just another possession to be taken into the next world. This practice, though horrifying to modern sensibilities, underscores the absolute power a chieftain held over his household, a power that was believed to extend beyond the grave. Every object in the tomb was a piece of a puzzle, a carefully chosen element to reconstruct a life of power and privilege. It was a message to the gods and to future generations. This was a person who mattered, a ruler whose influence was so great that not even death could diminish it. For the most powerful Viking leaders, even a monumental burial mound was not enough. The ultimate expression of status, the most sacred and spectacular of all funerals, was the ship burial. This was not just a means of interment. It was a profound spiritual statement, a fusion of wealth, power, and cosmic belief that sent the deceased on their final voyage in the very vessel that had defined their life. The ship was the heart of the Viking world. It was a tool of trade, a weapon of war, and a symbol of adventure and exploration. It was the vessel that carried them to new lands, to riches, and to glory. So, it was only fitting that it should also be the vessel that carried them to the afterlife. In a ship burial, a full-size longship was dragged ashore and placed in a deep trench. The deceased chieftain or king was then laid to rest in a specially constructed burial chamber built in the middle of the ship. The ship itself became the coffin, a magnificent, seaworthy tomb. The chamber was then filled with an astonishing array of grave goods, even more lavish than those found in a typical mound burial. We know about these incredible rituals thanks to a few miraculously preserved archaeological finds. The most famous examples, unearthed in Norway, have given us an unparalleled glimpse into this practice. In one, a nearly 70-foot-long ship was found, containing the remains of a powerful chieftain, his weapons, his horses, his dogs, and even a peacock, a symbol of unimaginable luxury and exoticism. In another, an even more ornate ship held the remains of two women, likely a queen and her attendant, surrounded by intricately carved wooden furniture, sledges, wagons, and a breathtaking collection of textiles and household goods. These finds reveal that ship burials were not just for men. Powerful women could also receive this highest of honors. Once the body and grave goods were in place, the ship was either buried under a massive mound of earth and stone, creating a permanent, ship-shaped monument in the landscape, or in some cases, it was pushed out to sea and set ablaze, becoming a floating pyre, a fiery beacon carrying the soul to the other side. A ship burial was a statement of almost divine power. It required immense resources, a valuable ship, a hoard of treasure, and the labor of the entire community. It was a funeral fit for a sea king, a final magnificent voyage into the realm of myth, a testament to a life lived on the waves, and a belief that the journey did not end with death. It simply continued on a different, darker sea. The flickering torchlight illuminates a scene of chilling ritual. A great chieftain has died, and he will not be traveling to the afterlife alone. As his body is prepared and his grave goods are assembled, a darker ceremony unfolds alongside it. The ritual sacrifice of those who will serve him in death as they did in life. While not a universal practice, human sacrifice was a real and terrifying aspect of some elite Viking funerals, a stark demonstration of a leader's power and the brutal realities of a slave-owning society. Our most vivid and most disturbing account of this practice comes not from a saga, but from an outside observer. An Arab diplomat and traveller who journeyed up the Volga River in the 10th century witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain, the Scandinavian Vikings who had settled in Eastern Europe. He recorded what he saw in meticulous, horrified detail. According to his account, when the chieftain died, his household was asked who would volunteer to die with him. A young thrall girl, an enslaved woman, stepped forward. For the next 10 days, while the chieftain's ship was being prepared for his funeral pyre, she was treated like royalty. She was dressed in fine clothes, given copious amounts of alcohol, and engaged in ritualized sex with the chieftain's closest companions. She sang, she feasted, and she was celebrated. But it was a celebration with a fatal deadline. On the day of the funeral, the girl was led to the ship. She visited the tents of the chieftain's warriors, bidding them farewell. She was given more to drink, to dull her senses, or elevate her spirit. She sang her final songs, songs of farewell to the world of the living. Then she was taken into the burial chamber on the ship by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, a sort of ritual executioner. There, she was laid beside her dead master. While men beat their shields to drown out her cries, some of the chieftain's men held her down, and the angel of death strangled her with a rope while simultaneously stabbing her between the ribs. Her life was extinguished, a final, violent offering. Her body was then placed beside the chieftain, the ship was set on fire, and the two of them, master and slave, ascended to the heavens in a pillar of smoke and flame. Archaeological evidence supports these grim accounts. In some high-status graves, the remains of multiple individuals have been found, often positioned in ways that suggest they were not willing participants. These were not just companions, they were possessions, their lives considered part of the chieftain's wealth, to be taken with him as surely as his sword or his drinking horn. This was the dark underbelly of Viking honor, a world where one person's glorious journey to Valhalla was paved with the bodies of those they had owned. While burial in the earth or within a ship was common, another, more dramatic funeral rite was also practiced throughout the Viking world: cremation. This was not a simple disposal of the body. It was a powerful, transformative ritual, a spectacular release of the soul through fire and smoke. The choice between burial and cremation was not random. It was often dictated by regional traditions, family customs, and specific spiritual beliefs. In some areas, cremation was the dominant practice for centuries. The centerpiece of a cremation funeral was the pyre, a massive bonfire built of wood. The deceased, dressed in their finest clothes and accompanied by their grave goods, would be placed atop the pyre. The same array of items found in burials, weapons, tools, jewelry, and even sacrificed animals would be consumed by the flames alongside the body. The symbolism was profound. Fire was seen as a purifying force, a powerful element that could cleanse the body and release the spirit from its mortal bonds. The smoke, rising towards the sky, was a visible representation of the soul's journey to the afterlife, a direct path to the realm of the gods. It was a dramatic, public spectacle, a final, fiery farewell that would have been visible for miles. The sagas describe these events with awe. A great chieftain's cremation would be a major community gathering. As the flames roared, stories would be told, songs would be sung, and the life of the deceased would be celebrated. It was a moment of both grief and communal pride. After the fire had burned down, the remains were collected. This was not just a pile of ash. It included charred bone fragments and the melted, warped remains of the metal grave goods. These were carefully gathered and then buried. Sometimes the cremated remains were placed in a ceramic urn. Other times, they were simply scattered within a small pit. This burial was often then covered with a stone setting or a small mound, creating a permanent memorial. Cremation was particularly associated with Odin, who in some myths was linked to fire and sacrifice. It was believed by some that a fiery death was a more direct route to Valhalla. The fire consumed the physical form, allowing the essence of the warrior to ascend unimpeded. The choice to burn was a choice to transform. It was a belief that the body was merely a temporary vessel, and that the true self, the soul, was something eternal, something that could be freed by the all-consuming power of the flame. It was a funeral of smoke and spirit, a final dramatic ascent into the realm of legend. Of all the destinations in the Norse cosmos, none is more famous, more celebrated, and more misunderstood than Valhalla. This was not a heaven for everyone. It was an exclusive, members-only club for the warrior elite. A celestial feasting hall where the glorious dead prepared for the end of the world. Valhalla, meaning Hall of the Slain, was Odin's personal domain in Asgard, the realm of the gods. It was a magnificent, impossibly grand structure. Its roof was tiled with golden shields. Its rafters were spears, and benches were strewn with chainmail. According to myth, it had 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through shoulder to shoulder. This was not a place for quiet reflection. It was a barracks for the divine army. Getting into Valhalla was not easy. The only way to secure a spot was to die a heroic death in battle. When a worthy warrior fell, the Valkyries, Odin's fearsome and beautiful battle maidens, would descend from the heavens to choose the slain. They were the celestial talent scouts, selecting only the bravest and best to become Einherjar, the lone fighters of Odin's army. Once in Valhalla, the afterlife was a warrior's paradise. Every day, the Einherjar would wake up, arm themselves, and march out into the great fields of Asgard to fight each other to the death. They would spend the day hacking each other to pieces in glorious bloody combat. But this was a death with no consequence. At the end of the day, all their wounds would magically heal, and they would all rise again, whole and hale. Then, they would return to the great hall for the evening's festivities. The feasts were legendary. They would dine on the meat of the boar Sehrimnir, a magical beast that was cooked every night and was whole again by the next morning. They would drink endless quantities of mead, served to them by the Valkyries, from the udder of the goat Heidrun, who grazed on the leaves of the world tree, Yggdrasil. The nights were filled with feasting, drinking, boasting, and storytelling. It was an eternal cycle of glorious violence and raucous celebration. But this was not an afterlife of idle pleasure. The Einherjar had a purpose. They were being trained, tested, and kept in fighting shape for a single, ultimate event. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. When the final battle came, the Einherjar would march out of Valhalla's 540 doors to fight alongside Odin against the giants and the forces of chaos. Their eternal life was not a reward. It was a recruitment. They were the chosen army, the last line of defense for the gods. Valhalla was the ultimate warrior fantasy, a perfect fusion of honor, violence, and eternal glory. It was a powerful motivator, driving Viking warriors to acts of incredible bravery and recklessness, all for the chance to be chosen, to feast with Odin, and to fight at the end of the world. While Valhalla looms large in our imagination, it was not the only five-star resort for fallen warriors. According to Norse mythology, Odin did not get his pick of all the slain. He had to share. Half of the warriors who died heroically in battle were chosen by the goddess Freyja to reside in her own celestial realm, Folkvanga, the field of the people, or army field. This detail, often overlooked, reveals a fascinating complexity in Viking beliefs about the afterlife and highlights the immense power and status of Freyja. Freyja was not a gentle, passive deity. She was a goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and sex. But she was also a goddess of war, magic, and death. She was a powerful figure from the Vanir, a tribe of gods distinct from Odin's Aesir, and she was a master of Seder, a potent form of Norse magic. The fact that she had the right to claim half of the battlefield, dead, a right equal to that of Odin himself, shows that she was his peer, not his subordinate. She rode into battle on a chariot pulled by 2 cats and was sometimes depicted as a warrior goddess, a leader of the Valkyries. What life was like in Folkvanga is far less detailed in the surviving myths than life in Valhalla. The primary source, the Prose Edda, tells us that her hall within Folkvanga was called Sessrumnir, the Hall of Many Seats. It was described as great and fair. There, she would welcome the warriors she had chosen. Unlike Valhalla, which is explicitly described as a training ground for Ragnarok, the purpose of the warriors in Folkvanga is not clearly stated. Were they also part of a divine army? Did they feast and fight in a similar manner? Or was the afterlife in Freya's hall different, perhaps focused on other pursuits? The ambiguity is tantalizing. Some scholars suggest that Folkvanga might have been a more inclusive afterlife, perhaps welcoming shield maidens or women who died in childbirth, reflecting Freya's role as a goddess of both fertility and war. This is speculative, but it points to a more nuanced understanding of the Norse afterlife than the purely masculine vision of Valhalla. The existence of Folkvanga complicates the simple narrative of the Viking warrior's dream. When a warrior fell, their fate was not certain. They might be chosen by Odin, or they might be chosen by Freya. This duality suggests a sophisticated cosmology with competing divine powers and multiple paths for the honored dead. It reminds us that Freya was a formidable and revered deity, a goddess who commanded not just love, but the souls of fallen heroes. Her realm, Folkvanga, remains a beautiful and mysterious counterpart to Valhalla, a testament to a goddess who was every bit the equal of the All-Father. If you were a Viking and you didn't die with a sword in your hand, your soul was not destined for the glorious halls of Valhalla or the mysterious fields of Folkvanga. For you, and for the vast majority of people, the farmers, the merchants, the women, the children, and the elderly who died a straw death, the afterlife journey led to a different, far more somber destination. Welcome to Hell, the Norse underworld. Forget the Christian imagery of fire, demons, and eternal torment. Hell was not a place of punishment for sins. It was simply the place where everyone else went. It was a neutral ground, a shadowy, cold realm located deep beneath the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil. It was ruled by a goddess of the same name, Hel, a daughter of the trickster god Loki. Her appearance was said to be terrifying. Half of her body was that of a beautiful woman, while the other half was that of a rotting corpse, a stark embodiment of the duality of life and death. The journey to hell was long and arduous. The soul had to travel down a dark road, cross the roaring river Gjöll over a bridge guarded by a giantess, and finally pass through the gates of hell, which were guarded by the monstrous hound, Garma. It was a bleak and lonely pilgrimage. Once inside, the realm of hell was a vast and gloomy place. It was described as a misty, cold world, a mirror image of the land of the living, but devoid of light, warmth, and joy. The dead who resided there were not tortured. They simply existed. They were believed to carry on a semblance of their former lives, but in a muted, joyless fashion. There were halls, tables, and beds, but the food was hunger, the knife was starvation, and the bed was sickness. It was a world of shadows and echoes, a place of perpetual twilight and melancholy. The sagas offer glimpses into this grim kingdom. When the god Balder was killed, his father Odin's messenger, Hermodr, rode for 9 nights through dark valleys to reach Hel and plead for his return. The description of his journey paints a picture of a desolate and unwelcoming realm. To the Vikings, the fate of going to hell was not terrifying because of pain, but because of its sheer bleakness. It was an eternity of being forgotten, of being excluded from the glory and camaraderie of Valhalla. It was the ultimate anticlimax. This is why the straw death was so feared. It wasn't just about dying without honor. It was about being condemned to an afterlife of eternal grey boredom. It was a powerful incentive to live a life of action and courage, to strive for a death that would elevate you to the halls of the gods, rather than condemn you to the cold, silent halls of the dead at the bottom of the world. While the great halls of Valhalla and Hell dominated Norse eschatology, Viking beliefs about the afterlife were not monolithic. They were a complex tapestry of older, more intimate, and sometimes contradictory ideas. For many, the journey after death did not lead to a distant divine realm, but to a place much closer to home, the earth and the sea. For a people whose lives were so intimately tied to the water, it is no surprise that the sea itself was seen as a potential afterlife. This was particularly true for those who drowned. It was believed that sailors and fishermen who met their end in the waves were not lost, but were taken in by the sea goddess, Ran, and her husband, Aegir. Ran was a fearsome deity, often depicted as a cruel goddess who dragged sailors down to their deaths with a great net. Her underwater hall was a place where the drowned feasted and drank, a watery grave that became an eternal home. This belief provided a strange sort of comfort. A sailor lost at sea was not a wandering, restless spirit. He was in Ran's keeping, a permanent resident of the deep. Another powerful belief centered on the burial mound itself. The dead, especially powerful chieftains, were not always thought of as having left. Instead, they were believed to continue living within their barrows, in a state of undeath. The mound was not just a tomb, it was their new home. From within their earthen halls, these ancestors could watch over their living descendants, offering protection, wisdom, and good fortune. People would visit the mounds to make offerings of food and drink, to seek guidance in times of crisis, or simply to feel a connection to their lineage. The ancestor in the mound was a powerful, tangible presence in the community. However, this belief had a dark side. If an ancestor was not properly buried, or if they were a particularly malevolent person in life, they might not rest peacefully. Instead, they could become a Draugr, a terrifying undead creature that would haunt the mound and terrorize the living. This leads to the most intimate afterlife belief of all, that the dead never truly leave. Their spirits could linger around the farmstead, their presence felt in the creak of a floorboard or a whisper on the wind. The line between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin, permeable. The ancestors were always close, a part of the landscape, the community, and the family. This collection of beliefs shows that the Viking afterlife was not a simple choice between a good place and a bad one. It was a rich and varied cosmology, with different paths for different deaths, and a profound sense of connection to the natural world. Whether in a feasting hall in the sky, a watery hall beneath the waves, or an earthen hall in the heart of the land, the journey after death was as diverse as life itself. In the Viking world, death was not always the end. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a whole new kind of trouble. If the dead were not properly buried, if they held a grudge, or if they were simply too mean to stay put, they could rise again. Not as a ghostly apparition, but as a draugr, the Norse version of a revenant, and one of the most terrifying creatures in their folklore. A draugr was not a mindless zombie. It was the animated corpse of the deceased, retaining a shadowy semblance of its former intelligence and personality, but twisted by a malevolent, supernatural force. It possessed immense physical strength, capable of tearing a man limb from limb. It could swell to a monstrous size, and its weight was so great that it could crush anyone it wrestled with. The draugr was a creature of pure physical horror. They usually haunted their own burial mounds, jealously guarding the treasure buried with them. Anyone foolish enough to attempt to rob the grave would be met with a grotesque and violent end. But a draugr's reign of terror was not always confined to its barrow. They could wander the countryside, driving livestock mad, tormenting the living in their homes, and killing anyone who crossed their path. They were described as having a horrific stench, the smell of decay, and their skin was often corpse blue or deathly pale. The sagas are filled with chilling accounts of heroes who must confront these undead nightmares. In the saga of Greta the Strong, the hero battles a draugr named Glam, a terrifying creature that rides on the roofs of houses and breaks the spines of shepherds. Their fight is a brutal, supernatural wrestling match that leaves Greta cursed for the rest of his life. Dealing with a draugr was not a simple matter. They were incredibly difficult to kill. They were immune to most weapons. The only way to truly defeat one was to overpower it, behead it, and then burn the body to ashes. Sometimes the head had to be placed between the corpse's thighs to prevent it from rising again. The fear of the draugr had a profound impact on Viking burial customs. Certain rituals were performed to prevent the dead from walking. The corpse might be carried out of the house through a special corpse door, which was then bricked up, so the spirit could not find its way back. The soles of the deceased's feet might be tied together, or needles might be driven through them to pin them to the grave. The belief in the draugr reveals a deep-seated anxiety in the Viking worldview. It was the fear that the barrier between life and death was not as secure as one might hope. It was the terror of the past literally rising up to destroy the present. The draugr was more than a monster. It was a physical embodiment of unresolved issues, of grudges that transcended the grave, a terrifying reminder that some people are simply too stubborn, too greedy, or too evil to let something as trivial as death stop them. To the modern mind, the soul is often conceived as a single, unified essence, but for the Vikings, the concept was far more fluid and multifaceted. A person was not a singular entity, but a composite of several distinct spiritual and physical components, each with its own function and fate. This complex understanding of the self shaped their views on life, death, and the supernatural. One of the key components was the leek, the physical body. This was the vessel, the mortal shell that housed the other, more ethereal parts. At death, the leek would decay or be consumed by fire, but it could also be reanimated, as in the case of the draugr. Then there was the hamr, which translates roughly to shape or skin. This was a person's physical form, but it was not fixed. A skilled practitioner of magic, particularly Saida, was believed to be able to change their hamr. taking on the form of an animal like a bear, a wolf, or a bird. This was not just a disguise, it was a true transformation, a process known as shapeshifting. The ability to travel in a different hamr, while the physical body lay in a trance, was a sign of immense spiritual power. Another crucial element was the hygge. This was the mind, the thought, the personality, and the will. It was the seat of a person's character and courage. A strong hygge made a person brave and resolute, while a weak one made them cowardly and indecisive. The hygge could also travel outside the body, sometimes appearing to others in dreams or as an apparition. After death, the hygge was the part of the soul that journeyed to one of the afterlives, be it Valhalla or hell. Perhaps the most mysterious component was the fylgja. This word means follower, and it represented a kind of attendant spirit or double that was attached to a person or a family line. A fylgja often took the form of an animal, and the type of animal reflected the character of the person it followed. A great chieftain might have a bear or a wolf as his fylgja, while a more peaceful person might have a deer. The fylgja acted as a guardian spirit, but seeing your own fylgja was often an omen of your impending death. This intricate web of spiritual parts meant that a person existed on multiple planes at once. Their body was in the physical world, but their mind could wander, their shape could change, and their spirit double walked beside them. This worldview explains many of the supernatural elements in the sagas. When a hero has a premonition, it might be their hygge sensing danger. When a sorcerer appears as a wolf, it is their hammer at work. This complex understanding of the soul made the world a far more magical and interconnected place. Death was not the simple extinguishing of a light, but the separation of these various components, each embarking on its own strange and mysterious journey. The Viking world was a haunted one, teeming with spirits, ghosts, and the lingering presence of the dead. Beyond the physical horror of the draga, there was a whole spectrum of supernatural encounters that shaped daily life. The barrier between the living and the dead was thin, and communication, both intentional and accidental, was a constant possibility. Ghosts in the Norse world were not necessarily malevolent. They were often just present. An ancestor might appear in a dream to offer advice, to warn of impending danger, or to complain about the state of their burial mound. These were not terrifying apparitions, but a continuation of family relationships beyond the grave. A farmer might leave an offering of ale at an ancestral stone, not just out of respect, but as a practical way to keep the spirits happy and ensure a good harvest. The dead were still part of the community, and maintaining good relations with them was crucial for the prosperity of the living. However, not all spirits were benign. The ghost of someone who had been murdered or died with a grievance might become a restless, vengeful spirit, a haugobui, mound dweller, that was not as physically dangerous as a draga, but could still cause misfortune, sickness, and unease. These spirits needed to be appeased, often through rituals, new offerings, or by resolving the injustice that kept them tethered to the world. Omens and portents were everywhere, many of them linked to the dead. Seeing a person's fylgja, their spiritual double, was a sure sign that their death was near. The cries of certain birds, the behavior of animals, or unusual weather phenomena could all be interpreted as messages from the other world. This was a world alive with meaning, where every event was part of a larger cosmic conversation. The belief in ghosts and spirits also influenced the architecture and layout of the farmstead. Certain places were considered spiritually charged: ancient burial mounds, large boulders, or old trees. These were to be avoided after dark and treated with respect. The design of the longhouse itself, with its single central door, was sometimes thought to have a spiritual purpose, making it easier to watch for and ward off unwanted, supernatural visitors. The interaction with the dead was not just about fear, it was about knowledge. The dead were believed to hold wisdom that the living did not. This is why powerful seeresses, or voleurs, were so revered. They had the ability to bridge the gap, to speak with the dead, to summon spirits, and to glean knowledge from the other side. A séance, as described in some sagas, was a terrifying but vital ritual, a direct line of communication to the wisdom of the ancestors. In this haunted landscape, life was a constant negotiation with the unseen. The spirits were neighbors, the ghosts were family, and the dead were never truly gone. They were simply on the other side of a very thin veil. When a death occurred in a Viking community, it was not a private sorrow to be borne in silence. It was a communal event, a tear in the social fabric that had to be carefully mended through a series of public rituals. Mourning was a structured process designed to honor the dead, comfort the living, and reaffirm the bonds of kinship and community. The period between death and the funeral was a time of intense activity. The body was prepared, and the family would hold a wake, where friends and relatives would gather to watch over the deceased. This was a time for sharing stories, reciting poetry, and celebrating the life that had been lost. It was a somber occasion, but it was also a social one. The most important ritual following the funeral was the erfi, or grave ale. This was a grand funeral feast, a lavish celebration that served several crucial purposes. First, it was a way to honor the deceased with a magnificent send-off. The more splendid the feast, the greater the honor. Second, it was a public declaration of the heir's succession. By hosting the feast, the new head of the family formally claimed their inheritance and their new status. Guests would witness this transfer of power, solidifying the heir's legitimacy. During the feast, toasts would be drunk to the memory of the dead, and memorial poems would be recited. But the grave ale was also a legal and social turning point. It was at this feast that the inheritance was formally settled. The heir would sit in the high seat for the first time, and the distribution of property among the family would be confirmed. This was a critical process, as disputes over inheritance could easily lead to blood feuds. The feast was a way to manage this potentially explosive transition in a public and binding way. Grieving itself was also performative. Women, in particular, were expected to express their sorrow openly. They would weep, wail, and sometimes compose and sing elaborate funeral dirges. This was not seen as a sign of weakness, but as a necessary and honorable expression of loss. The emotional health of the community required that grief be given a voice. The memory of the deceased was kept alive not just through stories, but through physical monuments. For the wealthy, this meant the burial mound. For others, it might be a rune stone, a carved stone raised by the side of a road or bridge, telling the story of the person who had died and who had honored them. These rituals were essential. They provided a structured way to navigate the chaos of loss. They turned a private tragedy into a public reaffirmation of order, lineage, and community. In the Viking world, you did not mourn alone. You mourned together. And in that shared ritual, you found the strength to carry on. In a world where the line between the living and the dead was perilously thin, there were those who could walk between the realms. These were the Völur, singular, Völva, the seeresses of the Norse world. Powerful female shamans who held a unique and often feared position in society. The Völva was a master of Seder, the most potent and dangerous form of Norse magic, a practice associated with divination, prophecy, and manipulating fate. A Völva was not a hedge witch or a village healer. She was a professional, a traveling specialist who was called upon in times of great crisis or uncertainty. Chieftains and kings would summon her to their halls to foretell the outcome of a battle, to diagnose a mysterious illness, or to uncover the cause of a famine. Her arrival was a major event, and she was treated with a mixture of immense respect and profound fear. The sagas provide a vivid picture of these women. A Völva was often an older woman who travelled with a staff and a group of attendants. She dressed in distinctive, sometimes exotic clothing, a blue or black cloak, a headdress of animal skin, and a belt from which hung a pouch containing her magical tools. Her presence was imposing, her gaze unsettling. Her primary role was to see into the unseen. The most famous depiction of a Völva's ritual comes from the poetic Edda. In the poem Völuspa, the prophecy of the seeress. In a ceremonial setting, the Völva would enter a trance state, often by sitting on a high platform and chanting special songs or galdra. In this state, she could journey into the spirit world, communicate with the dead, and gain knowledge from gods, giants, and ancestors. One of her most important functions was in matters of death. A Völva could be summoned to speak with a recently deceased person to find out why their spirit was restless. She could diagnose an illness as being caused by a curse or a malicious spirit. She could perform rituals to protect the living from the malevolent dead. She was a spiritual diagnostician and a metaphysical surgeon, but her power was a double-edged sword. Cider was considered by some to be unmanly, and while a woman could practice it with authority, it was a dark and dangerous art. The Völva dealt with forces that could destroy as well as heal. She could cast curses as well as blessings. She walked in the shadows, and her knowledge came at a price. She was an outsider, both revered and ostracized, a necessary but unnerving presence. In a world defined by the sword and the shield, the Völva wielded a different kind of power, the power of knowledge, of prophecy, of the spirit. She was the keeper of the mysteries, the voice of the dead, and the weaver of fate itself. In the Viking Age, a sharp blade was not the only thing that could kill you. The world was filled with unseen dangers, and one of the most feared was death by magic. A curse, whispered on the wind or carved into a piece of wood, could bring down the strongest warrior. Seder, the potent magic of the Norse world, could be used not just to see the future, but to twist it into a nightmare. The fear of malevolent magic, or black magic, was pervasive. A sudden unexplained illness, a series of misfortunes, or a string of livestock deaths could all be attributed to a magical attack. This was not seen as superstition. It was a rational explanation in a world where the spiritual and physical realms were deeply intertwined. Curses were a common form of magical warfare. A person who had been wronged could hire a sorcerer or perform a ritual themselves to bring ruin upon their enemy. One of the most infamous forms of cursing was the nidstang, or scorn pole. This involved erecting a pole, often with a horse's head mounted on top, and carving runes onto it that directed a curse at a specific person. The pole was aimed in the direction of the enemy, and it was believed that this act would invite the wrath of the land spirits and other malevolent forces upon the victim, causing them to sicken, lose their luck, or die. The sagas are filled with instances of magical attacks. In the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, the hero Egil, a master of both poetry and magic, erects a scorn pole against King Eirik Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, cursing them to be driven from Norway. His curse works. Gunhild herself was a powerful sorceress, known for using her magic to persecute her enemies. The fear of such attacks meant that people also sought out magical protection. Amulets, such as the famous Thor's hammer, were worn to ward off evil. Protective runes could be carved onto homes, ships, and weapons. People would consult seeresses or wise men to determine if they were the target of a curse and to learn how to counteract it. Death by magic was a terrifying prospect because it was invisible and often unstoppable. It could come from a jealous neighbor, a political rival, or a powerful sorcerer miles away. It turned the world into a place of paranoia, where a sudden illness was not a random event, but a targeted assault. This belief in magical harm also had a dark social consequence. It could lead to witch hunts. If a community was suffering from plague or a famine, they might look for a scapegoat, someone to blame for their misfortune. A person who was unpopular, an outsider, or known to dabble in the darker arts, could be accused of causing the calamity through magic. The punishment for such a crime was often brutal: drowning, burning, or being stoned to death. In this world of curses and counter-curses, life was a constant spiritual battle. The greatest threats were not always the ones you could see, but the ones you could only feel. A cold dread on the back of your neck, a whisper of malice in the wind. The Viking worldview was profoundly shaped by one overwhelming, inescapable concept: Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. This was not a vague, distant apocalypse. It was a detailed, prophesied cataclysm, a final, world-shattering battle that would result in the death of the gods, the destruction of the cosmos, and its eventual rebirth. This belief in a predestined doom colored everything from a warrior's courage to a king's ambition. Ragnarok was not a story of good versus evil in the Christian sense. It was a story of order versus chaos, a tragic, heroic, and inevitable conflict. The prophecies foretold a series of terrible events that would signal its beginning. A great winter, the Fimbulvetter, would grip the world for 3 years without a summer. Morality would collapse, with brother fighting brother. The sun and moon would be swallowed by the great wolves Skirl and Hati. The world tree, Yggdrasil, would tremble, and all bonds would be broken. From the underworld, the trickster god Loki, freed from his chains, would lead an army of the dead and the giants. The fire giant Surge would emerge from the south with a sword of flame. The great serpent Jörmungandr would rise from the sea, flooding the earth. The Fenris wolf, Loki's monstrous son, would break his magical bindings. The gods of Asgard, knowing their doom was upon them, would prepare for the final battle. Odin, the Allfather, would lead the Einherjar, his army of fallen warriors from the halls of Valhalla. He would ride out to face the Fenris wolf, a battle he was fated to lose. Thor, the god of thunder, would fight his ancient nemesis, the world serpent. He would kill the serpent, but not before being fatally poisoned by its venom. The god Freyr would fight the fire giant Surtur and fall. The god Tyr and the hellhound Garma would kill each other. Loki and his rival, the god Heimdallr, would also slay one another. The battle would be a near-total annihilation. The fire giant Surtur would then engulf the world in flames, and the earth would sink into the sea. It was a vision of absolute destruction, but it was not the end. From the waters, a new, green earth would rise. A few gods would survive, and 2 humans, Lif and Lifthrasir, would emerge from hiding to repopulate the world. It was a cycle of death and rebirth on a cosmic scale. This belief in Ragnarok had a profound psychological impact. If even the gods were mortal and fated to die, then a warrior's own death in battle became less of a tragedy and more of a noble emulation of his deities. It fostered a kind of fatalistic courage. Life was temporary, glory was eternal, and everyone, from the lowest farmer to the highest god, had a part to play in the great, tragic drama of existence. The world was not a stable, permanent creation. It was a battlefield, and the final war was always just over the horizon. In the Norse worldview, your life was not entirely your own to shape. From the moment of your birth, your destiny was being woven by 3 powerful, mysterious figures known as the Norns. These female beings resided at the base of the world tree, Yggdrasil, by the well of Urd. They were the weavers of fate, and not even the gods could escape their design. The 3 principal Norns were named Urda, what has been, or fate; Verdandi, what is in the process of becoming, or the present; and Skuld, what shall be, or the future. They were not goddesses to be worshipped, but primordial forces, as ancient and inexorable as time itself. They spun the threads of life for every being in the cosmos, from gods and giants to humans and dwarves. Each thread represented a life, and the length and texture of that thread determined the person's lifespan and fortune. This concept of a predetermined fate, or wa, was a cornerstone of the Viking mindset. It did not necessarily mean that every single action was preordained, but that the major turning points of a person's life, and especially the moment of their death, were fixed. A warrior went into battle knowing that he would not die a moment before his allotted time. This belief did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it fostered a kind of fearless audacity. If your death was already written, there was no point in cowardice. You might as well face your destiny with courage and strive to achieve as much glory as possible in the time you had. As the famous line from a Norse poem goes, "Cattle die, kinsmen die. You yourself must also die. But one thing I know that never dies, the reputation of each dead man." Your actions, your honor, and the fame you earned in life were the only things that could outlive your woven thread. The Norns' judgment was final. In the sagas, heroes often have premonitions of their death, or a seeress might foretell their doom. They rarely try to escape it. Instead, they face it head-on, fighting to the last, making their end as memorable as their life. This acceptance of fate, this blend of fatalism and fierce individualism, is what gave the Viking warrior their legendary courage. They did not control when they would die, but they believed they could control how they died. And in doing so, they could shape the one thing the Norns could not touch: their legacy. The belief in word was not a source of despair, but a source of liberation. It freed a person from the fear of death and inspired them to live a life worthy of song. A life that would be remembered long after their thread had been cut by the unforgiving shears of fate. In a culture that so deeply valued reputation and legacy, the memory of the dead was not left to chance. It was carved in stone. After the funeral feast were over and the burial mounds were sealed, families would often raise a rune stone, a permanent, public monument to honor their fallen kin. These were not gravestones in the modern sense. They were memorials, billboards for the afterlife, placed strategically along roads, bridges, and at thing sites, where they would be seen by the entire community. A runestone was a massive undertaking. A suitable boulder or slab of rock had to be found, transported, and then painstakingly carved by a skilled rune master. The inscriptions were written in runes, the angular alphabet of the Germanic peoples. They were not long, rambling eulogies. They were concise, powerful statements that typically followed a set formula. The inscription would begin by naming the person who raised the stone in honor of the deceased. For example, Asmundr raised this stone in memory of his father, Björn. This was a crucial social act. By raising the stone, the heir was publicly demonstrating their piety, their wealth, and their rightful claim to their inheritance. It was a statement of both love and legitimacy. The inscription would then describe the deceased. It might mention their status, a very good thing. Their character, he was the best of landholders. Or most importantly, the manner of their death. Many runestones commemorate men who died in battle or on voyages to distant lands. He fell in the east with a war host. He was killed in England. These inscriptions transformed a private loss into a public story of adventure, courage, and honor. They were the Viking equivalent of a Medal of Honor and an obituary rolled into one. The carvings were often intricate and beautiful. The runic text was frequently written within the winding body of a serpent or a dragon, a powerful symbol in Norse mythology. Sometimes, the stone would also feature images: a ship, a warrior on horseback, or complex knotwork patterns. The stone would then be painted in bright, vibrant colours: red, black, white, making it a striking and unmissable landmark. Runestones were more than just memorials. They were social and political documents. They reinforced family ties, advertised a family's status, and recorded historical events. They were a way of weaving an individual story into the larger tapestry of the community. They ensured that a person's name and deeds would not be forgotten, that they would be read and remembered by travellers and neighbours for generations to come. In a world without books or mass media, the runestone was a powerful tool of communication, a final, enduring word that spoke of honour, loss, and the eternal human desire to leave a mark on the world. In the Viking worldview, the dead were not truly gone. They were simply in a different state of being. The ancestors were a powerful, active force in the lives of their descendants, a source of strength, guidance, and sometimes trouble. This deep-seated belief in the continued presence of the dead, known as ancestor worship, was a fundamental part of their spiritual landscape. The primary focal point for this worship was the burial mound. The family barrow was not just a cemetery, it was a sacred site, the ancestral home. It was believed that the spirits of the dead resided within their mounds, and from there they could watch over the family farmstead, ensuring its prosperity. The living had a reciprocal duty to care for the dead. This meant maintaining the mound, keeping it clear of weeds, and most importantly, making regular offerings. During important festivals, or at times of personal crisis, a person might go to their ancestral mound to seek help. They would leave offerings of food, ale, or valuable objects. This was not an act of fear, but of kinship, a continuation of the family bond across the veil of death. It was like visiting a powerful, elderly relative to ask for a favor. A happy ancestor could bring good luck, fertile fields, and healthy livestock. A neglected or angry ancestor, however, a diself, could bring misfortune, sickness, and famine. Maintaining a good relationship with the dead was a practical necessity. The ancestors also played a role in legitimizing power and land ownership. A chieftain's authority was derived in part from his connection to a powerful lineage of ancestors buried in the great mounds on his land. The mounds were a physical title deed, a tangible link to the founding fathers of the clan. To be able to point to a row of impressive barrows was to declare, "My family has been here for generations. We belong to this land, and this land belongs to us." This connection to the ancestors was deeply personal. Names of revered ancestors were often passed down through generations, a way of invoking their spirit and power in a newborn child. It was believed that some of the ancestors' qualities and luck, their hamming jar, could be inherited along with the name. The ancestors were not distant, abstract figures. They were an integral part of the family, the community, and the individual's identity. They were the roots of the family tree, and their strength flowed up into the living branches. This profound sense of continuity, this belief that life was a chain linking the past, present, and future, gave the Vikings a powerful sense of place and purpose. They were not isolated individuals, but part of an unbroken line of ancestors, a mighty river of kinship flowing through time. Not all Vikings died at home. Driven by a thirst for wealth, glory, and adventure, many Scandinavian men travelled to the far corners of the known world, serving as mercenaries, merchants, and explorers. One of the most famous destinations for these ambitious warriors was the Byzantine Empire, where they served in the emperor's elite personal bodyguard, the legendary Varangian Guard. But what happened if a Viking died so far from the fjords and forests of their homeland? Death in a foreign land presented a unique set of spiritual and practical challenges. The greatest fear for a Varangian guardsman was not dying in battle. That was an honourable end. But dying without the proper funeral rites. A proper burial was essential for a peaceful afterlife. To be buried in foreign soil, without family to perform the correct rituals, was a deeply unsettling prospect. There would be no ancestral mound to rest in, no family to raise a runestone, and no grave ale to celebrate their life. The body might be disposed of according to foreign customs, which, to a Viking, was a spiritual disaster. The Byzantines were Orthodox Christians, and their burial practices, with priests, crosses, and prayers to a foreign god, would have seemed alien and inadequate. A Christian burial would not send a warrior to Valhalla. This anxiety is reflected in the sagas and on runestones. Many stones were raised in Scandinavia in memory of men who had died in the east, in Griqualand, Greece, the Norse term for the Byzantine Empire. These memorials were a way for the family back home to perform a final act of honour, to ensure that their kinsman's name and deeds were not forgotten, even if his body lay in a distant, unknown grave. For example, the famous Piraeus lion, a statue that once stood in the harbour of Athens, was covered in runic graffiti carved by Varangian guardsmen in the 11th century. These were not just idle scribbles. They were declarations of presence, a way for these warriors to leave their mark, to say, "We were here." A defiant act against the anonymity of dying so far from home. Some Varangians, if they knew their end was near, would make arrangements for their wealth to be sent back to Scandinavia, with instructions for a memorial to be raised. Their worldly goods could fund the creation of a runestone or a cenotaph, an empty tomb that would serve as a focal point for their memory. Despite the immense wealth and prestige that came with serving in the Varangian Guard, there was always a trade-off. The price of fortune in a foreign land could be the loss of a proper place in the afterlife. It was a gamble that thousands of Viking warriors were willing to take, a testament to their incredible ambition, but also a source of their deepest spiritual fears. For centuries, the spiritual landscape of the Viking world was dominated by the old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and the promise of a glorious, violent afterlife. But starting in the 8th and 9th centuries, a new faith began to creep in from the south, carried by missionaries, merchants, and conquered peoples. This was Christianity, and its arrival would slowly but irrevocably transform every aspect of Viking life, especially their relationship with death. The transition was not sudden or simple. It was a long, complex process of conversion, conflict, and cultural fusion that spanned several hundred years. At first, the two belief systems coexisted, often in a strange and syncretic blend. A Viking chieftain might be baptized as a Christian to facilitate trade with a southern kingdom, but still hedge his bets by making an offering to Thor before a voyage. Archaeological finds from this period beautifully illustrate this blending. Pendants have been found that combine the Christian cross with the hammer of Thor, a kind of spiritual two-for-one deal. A person might be buried in a Christian manner, laid out east to west, in a simple grave, but still be sent into the afterlife with some of their pagan grave goods, like a sword or a piece of jewelry. It was a period of spiritual negotiation, of trying to reconcile the old ways with the new. But the core tenets of Christianity were fundamentally at odds with the Viking worldview. Christianity promised a heaven based on faith and moral conduct, not on dying in battle. It preached forgiveness, not blood feuds. It offered a single, all-powerful God, not a pantheon of flawed, warring deities. It condemned practices like polygamy, infanticide, and the ritual sacrifices that were part of the old pagan traditions. The biggest change came in the rituals surrounding death. Christian burials were uniform and egalitarian. Everyone, from king to commoner, was to be buried in consecrated ground, a churchyard. The practice of burying the dead with lavish grave goods was discouraged. In the Christian afterlife, you didn't need a sword or a drinking horn. The focus shifted from equipping the dead for a physical journey to praying for the salvation of their soul. The monumental burial mound and the spectacular ship burial were replaced by the humble cross. The belief in Valhalla faded, replaced by the promise of heaven, and the terror of hell. The concept of the Draugr was reframed, its malevolence now attributed to demonic forces rather than the restless spirit of an ancestor. The conversion was often driven from the top down. Kings and chieftains, like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, converted for political and economic reasons. Aligning with Christian Europe brought power, prestige, and trade advantages. They then imposed the new faith on their people, sometimes with brutal force. Pagan temples were torn down, sacred groves were desecrated, and those who clung to the old ways were persecuted. By the 12th century, the Viking Age was over, and Scandinavia had largely become part of Christian Europe. The old gods were not entirely forgotten. They survived in folklore, place names, and superstitions. But their dominion was broken. The promise of Valhalla had been replaced by the prayer for eternal peace, and the warrior's glorious end had been supplanted by the hope of a gentle death, and a place in a very different kind of paradise. With burial mounds and ship graves filled to the brim with swords, gold, and other precious items, it's no surprise that grave robbing was a serious and persistent problem in the Viking Age. A wealthy chieftain's tomb was not just a sacred monument, it was a treasure chest, a tempting target for the desperate, the greedy, or the simply audacious. The Vikings were acutely aware of this threat, and they went to great lengths to protect the eternal resting places of their dead. The sheer scale and construction of a burial mound was, in itself, a form of defense. These were not easy structures to break into. They were massive, compacted earthworks, often covered with a layer of stone. Tunneling into one would require immense effort, a lot of time, and would likely not go unnoticed. Ship burials buried under mounds were even more secure, the ship's hull providing an additional layer of protection. But physical deterrents were not always enough. The most powerful protection was spiritual. The Vikings believed that the dead, especially powerful ones, did not rest idly. They guarded their tombs. This belief gave rise to the terrifying figure of the Draugr, the animated corpse who would viciously attack anyone who dared to desecrate their grave. The sagas are filled with cautionary tales of would-be grave robbers who meet a gruesome end at the hands of an undead chieftain. These stories were more than just folklore. They were a powerful social deterrent, a warning that the price of stolen gold could be your own life. Curses were another form of supernatural security. Runestones raised near a tomb sometimes included explicit curses against anyone who might disturb the site. These inscriptions would call down the wrath of the gods, promise a life of misfortune, or condemn the violator to become a restless spirit themselves. For a society that deeply believed in the power of the spoken and written word, such a curse was not to be taken lightly. Despite these protections, grave robbing still occurred. The lure of treasure was simply too strong for some. Grave robbers were likely to be outsiders, people with no kinship ties to the deceased, or those who were so desperate that they were willing to risk both physical and spiritual retribution. If caught, the punishment for grave robbing was severe. It was a crime that violated the sacred bonds of kinship and community, and it was often punishable by death or outlawry. The practice of grave robbing reveals a fundamental tension in the Viking world. The conflict between the reverence for the dead and the very human temptation of wealth. It shows that even in a world governed by honor, fate, and fear of the supernatural, there were always those willing to gamble their soul for a handful of silver. The Draugr may have guarded the tomb, but the greatest monster was often human greed. Everything we know about Viking death, from their brutal battles to their intricate burials, comes from the silent stories left behind in the earth. For centuries, the sagas and the accounts of their enemies were our only windows into their world. But in the last century, a new kind of storyteller has emerged, the archaeologist. By carefully excavating graves, settlements, and battle sites, we can now piece together a far more intimate and accurate picture of how these people lived, fought, and died. The bones themselves are the most direct witnesses. Forensic analysis of Viking skeletons reveals a life of incredible hardship. Many show signs of healed fractures, a testament to a violent and physically demanding existence. Severe wear on teeth indicates a coarse diet, likely full of grit from grinding stones. Arthritis and other joint diseases were rampant, the result of a lifetime of manual labor. The skeletons of warriors often bear the marks of their trade: skulls with sword cuts, spines with arrow wounds, and limbs with the telltale signs of parry fractures, injuries sustained while blocking a blow. These bones don't just tell us how they died, they tell us how they survived. The grave goods buried with them provide a roadmap to their beliefs and social structure. The presence of weapons in a grave tells us this was a warrior. Weaving tools and jewelry indicate a woman of high status. The inclusion of scales and weights suggests a merchant. Imported goods, like silk from the East or glassware from Francia, map out their vast trade networks and speak to the wealth of the individual. The layout of their cemeteries reveals social hierarchies. The great burial mounds of the elite stand in stark contrast to the simple, unadorned graves of the common people. The orientation of the graves, the arrangement of the bodies, and the types of rituals performed all offer clues to their complex cosmology. Modern science has opened up even more possibilities. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can tell us where a person grew up, what they ate, and how far they travelled. DNA analysis can trace family lineages, confirm the sex of skeletons, and even identify the origins of the animals buried alongside them. For example, recent DNA studies of a famous warrior grave, long assumed to be male due to the weapons it contained, revealed the skeleton was actually that of a woman, a potential real-life shield maiden. Challenging, long-held assumptions about gender roles. Archaeology is a slow, painstaking process. It doesn't offer the grand, heroic narratives of the sagas. Instead, it offers something more precious: the quiet, undeniable truth of physical evidence. It allows us to hear the voices of the people who were not chieftains or kings, the ordinary men, women, and children whose lives were just as much a part of the Viking story. The bones, the pots, the rusted iron. They are the footnotes of history, and they speak volumes. When we picture a Viking, the image that often comes to mind is one of savage, bloodthirsty brutality, a horned, helmeted barbarian descending from the north to burn and pillage. This reputation, while not entirely unearned, was largely crafted by their victims and had been amplified by centuries of myth-making. The reality of Viking violence and how they viewed death is more complex and far more interesting. First, let's get one thing out of the way. Vikings did not wear horned helmets. This is a 19th century invention, popularized by costume designers for Wagner's operas. Real Viking helmets were simple, conical caps, sometimes with a nose guard. The image of the horned warrior is pure fantasy, but it has stuck, becoming a powerful symbol of their perceived savagery. The Vikings were, without a doubt, a violent people. Raiding was a central part of their economy and culture. They targeted monasteries and coastal towns, not just for their wealth, but because they were often poorly defended. The accounts of these raids, written by Christian monks who were the primary victims, are filled with horror. They describe Vikings as heathen wolves, agents of Satan who slaughtered priests, burned churches, and desecrated holy relics. These accounts, while containing truth, are also pieces of propaganda designed to portray the Vikings as monstrous, inhuman foes. This is where the myth of their unique brutality comes from. In truth, the Viking Age was a violent time for everyone. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were just as capable of extreme violence. Charlemagne, a celebrated Christian emperor, forcibly converted the Saxons, massacring thousands in the process. Blood feuds, political assassinations, and brutal executions were common across the continent. The Vikings were not exceptionally brutal, they were just exceptionally successful at directing their violence outward, and their victims happened to be the ones writing the history books. Their own view of violence was pragmatic and deeply tied to honor. A man was expected to defend his family and his reputation, with force if necessary. A blood feud was a legitimate, if destructive, way to seek justice for a slain kinsman. In battle, violence was not just a means to an end. It was a performance of courage, a way to earn a reputation that would outlive them. Their reputation as bringers of death was a tool. It inspired fear, and fear could be more effective than any weapon. They cultivated this image, using lightning-fast raids and overwhelming force to create a sense of shock and awe. They understood that a reputation for ruthlessness meant that the next town might simply surrender and pay tribute rather than risk annihilation. So, were they brutal? Yes, but they were not mindless savages. They were strategic, pragmatic, and living in an age where violence was the common language of power. Their relationship with death was not born of bloodlust, but of a cold, hard understanding of the world they lived in. A world where you either carved out your place with an axe, or you were erased. In the close-knit, interdependent world of the Viking farmstead, a death was not just an emotional blow, it was a social and economic crisis that could threaten the survival of the entire household. The loss of a family member sent ripples through the community, and the response was governed by a complex set of laws, customs, and expectations. When the head of the household, the patriarch, died, the impact was immediate. His death triggered a crucial transition of power and property. Viking inheritance laws, which varied by region, generally favored the eldest legitimate son. He would inherit the majority of the land, the farmstead, and the responsibility of becoming the new head of the family. Younger sons might receive smaller plots of land, movable goods, or be expected to seek their fortunes elsewhere, perhaps by going on raids or serving a powerful jarl. This system could be a source of tension. Disputes over inheritance were common and could easily escalate into violent conflicts between brothers, a theme that runs through many of the sagas. The funeral feast, the grave ale, was a critical moment for the heir to publicly assert his new role and for the inheritance to be formally recognized by the community. The role of the widow was also complex. A Viking woman did not automatically become destitute upon her husband's death. She had rights. She was entitled to her dowry and a portion of the household property. A widow with powerful kinsmen could wield considerable influence. Some chose to remarry, forging new alliances for their family. Others, especially if they were older and had adult sons, might choose to remain as the respected matriarch of the household, managing its affairs with authority. However, a young widow with small children was in a vulnerable position, and her future often depended on the goodwill of her late husband's family or her own kin. The death of a warrior in battle brought with it both honor and obligation. If a man was slain, his sons and close male relatives were bound by a code of honor to seek revenge or demand compensation, weregild, from the killer's family. This duty of the blood feud was a sacred responsibility. To leave a kinsman's death unavenged was to bring shame upon the entire family. This cycle of vengeance could last for generations, a destructive but socially necessary mechanism for maintaining a family's honor and deterring further violence. The death of a child, a tragically common event, was a deep personal sorrow, but it also had practical implications as it represented a loss of future labor and support for the family in their old age. In every case, a death reshaped the family. It was a moment of grief, but it was also a moment of restructuring, of reaffirming kinship ties, and of navigating the delicate balance of power, property, and honor that held Viking society together. In a culture that so despised the straw death and so glorified a heroic end in battle, the question of suicide is a complex and fascinating one. Was it an acceptable way out? Was it seen as an act of cowardice, or one of final, desperate courage? The answer, like so much in the Viking world, is not simple and is tied to the underlying motivations. There is little evidence to suggest that suicide due to despair or mental anguish was common or accepted. The Viking ethos was one of endurance and resilience. However, there were certain circumstances where taking one's own life was not only understood, but could even be seen as an honorable choice. The primary motivation was the avoidance of a dishonorable fate. An old warrior, facing the slow, undignified decline of sickness or old age, might choose a self-killing to escape the shame of a straw death and the grim afterlife in hell. This was not about ending suffering, but about controlling one's own narrative, about choosing a warrior's exit on one's own terms. Sagas describe figures who, knowing their end is near, might fall on their own sword, or orchestrate a final, fatal confrontation. This was seen as a way of riding to Odin, a last-ditch effort to claim a place in Valhalla. Another acceptable context for suicide was to avoid capture and humiliation by an enemy. A warrior, defeated and surrounded, might choose to kill himself rather than be taken prisoner, enslaved, or tortured. This was an act of ultimate defiance, a refusal to grant the enemy a final victory. Similarly, women might choose suicide to escape sexual violence or enslavement after their household was conquered. This was viewed as a tragic but honorable act of preserving one's dignity. There are also accounts of ritualistic suicide. In the context of a chieftain's funeral, a thrall girl might volunteer to be sacrificed, a choice that, while coerced, was framed as a willing journey to accompany her master. The lines between suicide, sacrifice, and execution could be blurry. However, it's crucial to distinguish these honor-based suicides from what we might consider suicide today. The Vikings did not have a concept of clinical depression. Their motivations were rooted in a social and spiritual framework, where honor in death was paramount. To choose death over shame was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of ultimate control over one's own fate, a final, defiant assertion of the Viking will in a harsh and unforgiving world. It was a way of ensuring that even if life had dealt you a bad hand, you could still choose how to play the final card. As the fires of the Viking Age began to die down, so too did the funeral pyres. The transformation of Scandinavian society from a pagan, tribal world to a collection of Christian kingdoms in the 11th and 12th centuries brought about a profound shift in how people approach the end of life. The old ways, with their spectacular burials, rich grave goods, and warrior afterlives, slowly gave way to a new, more uniform Christian cosmology. This was the end of an era, not just politically, but spiritually. The most visible change was in the burial practices themselves. The Christian Church insisted on burial in consecrated ground. The family farmstead and the ancestral mound were replaced by the communal churchyard. The practice of cremation, with its pagan associations, was abandoned. Everyone, from the king to the peasant, was to be buried in the same sacred space, facing east in anticipation of Christ's return. The lavish tradition of grave goods disappeared. In the Christian afterlife, you did not need your sword, your horse, or your drinking horn. Earthly possessions were meaningless. What mattered was the state of your soul. A simple shroud and a wooden cross replaced the gold, silver, and sacrificed animals of the past. The focus of the funeral shifted from a celebration of the deceased's life and status to a somber prayer for their eternal salvation. The blood-soaked promise of Valhalla was supplanted by the moral calculus of heaven and hell. A good death was no longer about dying in battle. It was about dying in a state of grace, having confessed your sins and received the last rites. The concept of the soul was simplified. The complex Norse idea of multiple spiritual components was replaced by the singular, immortal soul that would face a final judgment. The ancestors in the mound, once powerful guardians, were reframed as either saints to be venerated or demonic spirits to be feared. The runestone, that public declaration of honor and lineage, was gradually replaced by the gravestone, a more humble marker of an individual's life and faith. This transformation was not just a change in ritual, it was a fundamental reordering of the Viking worldview. The old, fatalistic acceptance of a predestined doom was replaced by a new emphasis on individual moral choice and the hope of redemption. The warrior ethos, which had defined their culture for centuries, was tamed and reshaped by a faith that preached peace, humility, and forgiveness. The Viking Age did not end with a final glorious battle. It ended with a quiet shift in belief, a slow and steady turning away from the old gods and toward a new one. It ended in the churchyards of Scandinavia, where the last generation of warriors was laid to rest, not with axes and shields, but with prayers and crosses. Their final journey not to Valhalla, but to a kingdom not of this world. To understand the Vikings is to understand their relationship with death. It was not a subject to be avoided or feared into silence. It was the central, organizing principle of their entire culture. Their unique and often brutal perspective on mortality was the engine that drove their society, fueled their ambitions, and forged their unforgettable identity. Their belief in a glorious afterlife for warriors, Valhalla, was more than just a myth. It was a powerful psychological tool. It transformed the terrifying, chaotic reality of battle into a noble, desirable pursuit. This belief fostered a culture of extreme courage and a willingness to take incredible risks. It is what powered the longships across treacherous seas and sent the shield walls crashing into their enemies. Without Valhalla, the Viking age of exploration and raiding as we know it might never have happened. Their obsession with legacy, the idea that a person's reputation was the only thing that never dies, shaped their social structure. The constant striving for honor, the sacred duty of the blood feud, and the public declaration of lineage on runestones were all driven by a deep-seated desire to leave a mark, to be remembered. This created a dynamic, competitive, and fiercely proud society where a person's deeds in life echoed long after their death. Their complex cosmology, with its multiple afterlives, its restless undead, and its thin veil between worlds, made for a reality that was vibrant, dangerous, and magical. The world was not a mundane collection of rocks and trees. It was a sacred landscape, alive with gods, spirits, and ancestors. This worldview gave meaning to every aspect of life, from the changing of the seasons to the sudden death of a child. It provided a framework for understanding a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. And finally, their belief in a predestined doom, Ragnarok, gave them a unique brand of fatalistic courage. If even the gods were mortal, then a human life was a fleeting, precious thing, a brief moment to shine before the inevitable darkness. This did not lead to despair, but to a fierce determination to live boldly, to face one's fate without flinching, and to die a death worthy of a saga. The Viking world view was a tapestry woven with threads of violence, honor, magic, and a profound acceptance of mortality. They did not just live with death. They invited it to the feasting table, challenged it to a wrestling match, and carved its story into stone. It was this intimate, unflinching relationship with the end that made them who they were. One of history's most fascinating, fearsome, and enduring cultures.